And this is what we need to focus, because this is the matter at hand, because you guys could get pissed off about whatever they have going on there. But the most important thing to recognize is that they are doing this in a way where they have found a loophole to have this massive grow up in an area that, I mean, we'll get into this a little bit, but this is a very spiritual area that we're in. And I keep dropping the F-bombs, I'm sorry about that. Since I started diving a lot deeper into my coverage of how organized crime groups have infiltrated all of North America, I mean, we know that this has been going on for years, but I've kind of narrowed in with this hawkeye view on how the cartels and pre-existing organized crime groups are operating across our continent. And I started to get a lot of messages from people, especially due to my northern border coverage. There were a lot of messages asking me to look into the reservations, the native reservations, and just how those communities, regions have become hotspots for organized crime groups to operate and exploit the sovereignty in these communities. So I went to a First Nation reserve in Canada, very close to the northern border, where I was actually contacted by a few women who described a marijuana grow-op that raised some concerns for them. I went to investigate. We're going to talk about that one in particular, but we're also going to talk about all of them and how and why criminals are using these communities to run their very lucrative operations. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Katarina Schultz, and this is Borderland Dispatches, an Ironclad original. All right, first things first, let's talk about how and why these organized crime groups are essentially finding jurisdictional loopholes through these Indigenous reserves in both the US and Canada. Now, they are sovereign or like semi-sovereign territories with their own distinct policing structures, legal frameworks, and there is a significant amount of limitation on federal oversight. Why does this matter? Because organized crime groups, including the Mexican cartels and outlaw motorcycle gangs, and even like native-based crime syndicates, can leverage multiple factors in these communities. First, there are sovereignty protections. Second, the geographic remoteness of a lot of these reserves, particularly those that are very close to the border. The jurisdictional fragmentation, the lack of consistent policing in terms of how the communication works between the tribal police, which is their own sovereign police force, and the municipal, state, provincial, or federal police. And of course, the proximity to international borders. I mean, you knew what you're here for, right? This is Borderland Dispatches. And we know that the borderlands are a hotspot for drug trafficking, illegal activity, human smuggling. And I'm trying to bring this to the forefront. Now, this geographic advantage has obviously become a key smuggling corridor, especially at the northern border, like I've talked about hundreds of times, that this is over 5,000 miles of essentially unmonitored border. It's open land. Of course, there is some level of technology and policing, but it's not to the extent that is preventing this flow of guns, people, and drugs from coming in and out or crossing over undetected. Now, there are multiple territories, particularly along the East Coast, that are very close to the border. And I'd like to mention, because I have been talking a lot about the Port of Vancouver, the drug production and trafficking on the West Coast. But in the East Coast, we're seeing high-level operations of straw buying, particularly from the U.S. into Canada, and then drug smuggling from Canada into the U.S. That's why I came here, because I thought I should show you guys. Of course, right? We've got to see it to believe it sometimes, unless my sources can't be on camera. So this area that kind of spans, there's a reserve along the St. Lawrence River here. It has been a major trafficking corridor for tobacco smuggling, weapons, and of course, human trafficking. And the river and multiple jurisdictional overlays kind of makes it difficult to enforce, especially when you couple that with low authority resources, policing resources, especially on the Canadian side. Another example of a region like this is the St. Regis Mohawk Reservation in New York. And then you've got the Six Nations Reserve near Hamilton, Ontario. That's on the East Coast in Canada. And this is where I went to show you this massive marijuana operation that's going on there, that residents on this reserve have called the police on before because they're concerned about what's happening there. I spoke to some of these residents. The concerns come from for different reasons. But this reserve has already been tied to illicit cigarette factories and cannabis smuggling. And now in the past year, this massive marijuana grow-op has been put up in the middle of this reserve. You have these massive cargo containers that essentially line the entrance. I was only able to get so far, but line the entrance into the grow-op. There's security, there's multiple no trespassing signs. And residents are complaining because, of course, they're upset that the land was clear-cut and this huge thing was put up, and no one from the community has been hired to work it. According to them, and footage, and what I saw, it's, for the most part, purely Chinese workers at this operation. When residents called the police, the tribal police was contacted to attend to the site, and they did not even go into this operation. And I don't want to come to any crazy conclusion, but I just want to put it out there for those of us that don't or may perhaps not want to read between the lines. Anything could be going on at this grow-up, okay? It may not just be marijuana. Who is this marijuana being sold to? This is happening in an area that has been knowingly previously linked to illegal marijuana and tobacco operations. This is happening in an area we've seen in the news time and time again, somewhat of high gang activity, smuggling activity. And like I've mentioned previously, marijuana was essentially the first connection between Canadian organized crime groups and the Mexican cartels. Prior to the legalization of marijuana, gangs in Canada were growing and trafficking BC Bud, the notorious marijuana, for everyone that smokes has definitely heard of it before. And at this point in time, prior to the legalization, BC Bud marijuana was priced on par with cocaine. And Canadian gangs were working to produce and traffic this marijuana directly with the Sinaloa cartel. The history book on the shelf is always repeating itself. Oh, I need to stop singing in these because you guys give me shit. Now, of course, this is happening at the northern border. So I went there to take a look, and I want you guys to see just how large this grow-up is, how closed off it is. I tried to get in. I trespassed so I could try to show you guys. There's security there, and the security guard is a resident on the Six Nations Reserve. But there's a lot of concerns from people. I mean, you know what? I do have to mention, I know people typically complain about everything, and especially changes in their community, and especially when they feel like they're not part of it. But there is validity to these concerns. Because like I said, we have seen this happen time and time again. And the women I spoke to are worried that there are criminals, known gangsters, or people affiliated with organized crime, working, or at least, at the very least, attending this location.
We'll go back to last year. They had that whole field with plants in the ground.
So it essentially looked like where all that green is further out, but all filled here before they clear cut it. So when did they clear cut it?
They started July of last year. So I finally got to this so-called commission, cannabis commission, and took my complaints.
Right.
Because nobody had ever told us anything about what was going on. So that's where it went wrong. Feels like somebody took your peace and your freedom on your own land. It's just like they're encroached on my life because I love the land. And they showed that time and time again when they were in their machines, pushing on that land, pushing on me, pushing on this is all I have right here. Like I own right up to that driveway, and I couldn't get away from it at any time, like any time of the day. It was always somebody was coming up that driveway, coming, trucks.
Oh, over the past just like half an hour that I've been here, we're seeing cars speed out. And this is what we need to focus, because this is the matter at hand, because you guys can get pissed off about whatever the fuck they have going on there. But the most important thing to recognize is that they are doing this in a way where they have found a loophole to have this massive grow up in an area that, I mean, we'll get into this a little bit, but this is a very spiritual area that we're in. And I keep dropping the F-bombs. I'm sorry about that. But for there to be this massive drug operation here, and we don't know exactly, I mean, by the time this episode is out, I'm going to show you exactly the guys that I've been shown of who's running this. And, you know, this is a little premature, but I could almost probably guarantee that the sources that I have looking into the very people responsible for this operation are, in some way or another, part of a criminal organization. And what is being done about this? What's being done about this?
We don't really know what's being done. And we didn't even know it was happening. The weed was in the ground by the time we even knew. And then we never got any notification that the greenhouses were going up.
Now, we're also seeing this happening at the southern border. Certainly the extent is different, and I don't think it's to the degree that's happening at these reserves up north. Now, at the Tohono O'odham Nation in Arizona, I'm so sorry for that pronunciation, I hope I'm close. This region spans 75 miles of the Mexico-US border, and it has been known to be frequently used by the Sinaloa cartel and other traffickers for moving fentanyl, meth, and migrants. This is rough desert terrain combined with somewhat of minimal border patrol presence, creating blind spots. And let's talk about this. What are these blind spots? And why is this happening at the reserves? We have to get into these legal and jurisdictional loopholes and these policing loopholes that make it very easy for organized crime groups to use Indigenous land as a way to run their operations, very much so under the radar. So reserve police forces are typically underfunded, understaffed, and unfortunately lack a lot of the training to deal with transnational organized crime. I mean, let's look at Canada, for example. If I'm already saying over and over again, and we're seeing it pop up constantly in a regular news cycle, that Canadian law enforcement is having difficulty dealing with transnational organized crime, how do we expect reserve police forces, who are not even operating at a level like a national police force, of course, to deal with these organized crime groups? They're facing threats, they're facing bribes, and they simply just don't have the manpower. In some cases, tribal officers even lack authority to arrest non-Indigenous suspects. For example, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1978 which literally barred tribal courts from prosecuting non-natives. So for these tribal police to even, if they get a call, okay, hypothetically they get a call, hey, we know that this organized crime stuff is going on, please go deal with it. First of all, I wouldn't even see why they would want to or how they would be able to. They get there and there is simply nothing they can do. Okay, say they maybe at the furthest extent arrest the person or a few people. There's no way in guaranteeing these people are even prosecuted. Now, it's also very important to keep in mind that people who are not native or from the actual reserve that the land is on cannot own that land. They can pay to possess it and use it for their business, but this also kind of ties into how deeply infiltrated a lot of these organized crime groups have become with local groups, whether they're transnational or domestic. They've managed to find this loophole in order to possess the land or do it through an individual who is a resident from this very reserve and use it to completely under the radar, again, manage illegal operations. Now, there seems to also be this sort of lack of cohesive bylaw enforcement. Not all reserves have clear or enforceable laws on cannabis cultivation, illegal firearms, or drug labs, and moreover, there is just a simple lack of oversight and also a level of corruption in terms of who in the authoritative body on these reserves are profiting and perhaps taking some money under the table in order to allow these things to go on. Some reserves operate in like a legal gray zone, particularly around tobacco, cannabis, and other substances of that nature. Now, in Canada, RCMP, OPP, SQ, whatever police force and reserve police can often have all these different partial roles in enforcement, which will lead to gaps. And then in the US, there have been conflicts between tribal, federal, and state enforcement. So we're kind of at a point, we've been at a point where everyone is kind of hands off, and I don't know who takes the lead here, which allows these illegal operations to just keep running while everyone else is sort of pointing fingers or trying to figure out who has to deal with it. So native reserves have legal rights to manufacture and sell tobacco tax-free to members, but we've seen historically that this is often abused to run illegal, untaxed bulk exports to non-native buyers. Actually, the reserve that I went to, Six Nations, is a major hub for tobacco production, and a lot of the reserves that have this high-level production can often be linked to multi-million-dollar black market supply chains. The ladies I spoke to were obviously very unhappy with that. And this is also, I'd like to kind of preface by saying that this is a convoluted topic. It's also very polarized. I recognize that. I grew up learning about this. I continue to read about this. And there's so much that goes beyond the surface of what I even have the capacity to talk about in a dispatch episode. At one point, the women even were telling me that they're concerned about non-residents working from 6 a.m. until 6 p.m. on the reserve, doing what they said essentially was God knows what at this marijuana grow up, when there's this huge issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We know about this in Canada, in the States, and of course, beyond. And it's easy to completely understand the concerns that can come with this, the paranoia and the anxieties, especially when sometimes you're thinking that these people are criminals. How do women who are already in a vulnerable position stay safe when there's alleged criminals operating possible criminal activities right in their backyards? I'm not saying this is exactly what's happening in this instance, but it's important to look at the big picture to fully understand what's going on. Now, we have seen that cartels and organized crime groups, even like the Hells Angels, have collaborated with indigenous smugglers for fentanyl and meth import and exports, weapons trafficking. This is via the US, and most of the guns that we're seeing in Canada, especially obviously those in the hands of organized criminals, are US manufactured weapons that shouldn't be here. In recent years, there's been notable seizures of stolen or modified firearms that are trafficked via reserves into major Canadian cities. I mean, keep in mind, Toronto, one of the largest cities in Canada, of course, it's a hub, a metropolis, is just over an hour away from the Six Nations Reserve that I was at. This is also a place that has a major problem with illegal firearm ownership. In 2016, there was an operation in Canada that uncovered Hells Angels and Indigenous run tobacco smuggling between Quebec reserves and the US, so Montreal to New York, vice versa. They made an estimated profit of over $100 million. And these funds are laundered into cocaine trafficking and weapons purchases. And this, of course, like we know how this life cycle works, therefore continues to fuel this cycle of organized crime transnationally. From the 2000s, early 2000s onwards, there's been multiple US and Canadian raids that have uncovered these complex smuggling routes for firearms, prescription pills, migrant smuggling, and this super notable cross-border gang activity that we're now sort of hearing about more and more. And the Department of Homeland Security has acknowledged cartel use of tribal lands for drug and migrant trafficking. It's even said in these reports that tribal police are typically outgunned. They don't have the same level of weaponry or manpower, and they're overwhelmed. So cartels and organized crime groups are together exploiting the lack of full infrastructure or surveillance in nation territory. And it makes absolute sense. There have been reports, existing reports, of individuals within reserves profiting from criminal activity or turning a blind eye. And this, of course, leads to rising tensions. It kind of leads to this battle between economic opportunity versus enforcement risks. Which side do these individuals find themselves on? This garners a lot of frustration in these communities that are already dealing with decades-long grievances. Now, there are certainly some tribal councils and community leaders that are actively trying to resist organized crime, which of course is a very difficult task. We know this. This is all we talk about. A lot of them will try to shut down illegal dispensaries. They collaborate with outside law enforcement bodies. And of course, they advocate for tribal sovereignty to be protected from criminal abuse, which is what I've been hearing over and over again that people want to see. I hope that it's really clear that I'm not in any way trying to vilify these Indigenous communities or reserves. I'm just bringing a grievance to the forefront and something that is essentially allowing transnational organized crime groups to continue to maintain their operations completely under the radar. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this very complex episode. I really appreciate it. Be sure to rate this episode, like and subscribe, and as always, I'll see you next time.